Hello everyone and welcome to the first class about adolescence. So we're going to talk today about definitions of adolescence and several characteristics. Let's start with the word itself. So what is the etymology for adolescence? Well, the word adolescence in English is derived from the Latin words adolentia or adolencia, which means to grow. And indeed, adolescence is a period of growth both physically and mentally, and we often talk about adolescents as people that are in between childhood and adulthood. They have a lot of childish characteristics still, and at the same time they want to be adults, they want to be independent, they want to be able to do their own things, and this is a constant struggle in adolescence that we're going to talk about extensively in this class. In Hebrew, the word youth, now, it derives from the root ni'el, which means to shake off and wake up. And indeed, another very important issue in adolescence is the adolescents' need to shake off the parents, shake off the teachers. And we're going to talk a lot about that as part of the adolescents' struggle for finding their own identity, their own individualism. That is a very important issue for adolescents, and so it is very expectable in that sense that the word in Hebrew comes from that verb that means to shake off and wake up. So adolescence, we can define it in many different ways. When I ask this question in class, a lot of people say that they would define adolescence as being the ages 12 to 18 years old, for example. That would be one way of doing it. But another way of doing it, we're going to talk here about a developmental perspective. And when we're talking about a developmental perspective, we're talking about the fact that the most crucial element of defining a developmental period, is to look at the developmental tasks that the person is confronting. And so in this sense, when we're talking about adolescence, I already mentioned identity as being a very prime kind of developmental task, and there are many others. Identity is the one that Erik Erikson, the famous renowned psychologist, mentioned. But there are many others. For example, the whole social issue is very important in adolescence, and we're going to talk about that as well. But when we talk about the beginning of adolescence, we cannot ignore biology as well. So there is, in addition to the concept of adolescence, also the concept of puberty. And puberty means that the secondary sex signs begin to emerge. In boys, we have semen. In girls, we have menstruation. It depends on the culture, but it's usually around the ages 11 to 12. And we often place the beginning of adolescence, the onset, at the beginning of puberty. On the other hand, the end of adolescence is very psychological, meaning that it's personal, it's subjective, it varies from person to person, from society to society. In this class, we're going to talk a lot about research coming from American society, Israeli society, and when I talk about Israeli society, actually I should be more specific and talk about Israeli secular Jewish society. So both these cultures, American and Israeli secular culture, are very individualistic, and so they are quite different from all sorts of more traditional cultures that we have in Israel and around the world. For example, within Israel we have the Arab society, we have the ultra-Orthodox Haredim, and so on. We will see that this will be quite different in these kind of societies, especially when we talk about the developmental tasks of individualism and identity. So ideally, the ending of adolescence will be when the person forms a mature, independent identity and is able to continue on to the next developmental task that Erikson outlined as being intimacy. Of course, we do not expect a person who is 18 years old to have such a totally independent, mature identity, but we can still see how the developmental task changes when a person has more of an understanding of who he is or who she is and moves on to other developmental tasks. So today we're not talking about 12 to 18. Usually we're talking about mid-20s when we're talking about the end of adolescence. And we can actually also parse the adolescence period into 3 different phases. So early adolescence would be 11 to 14 years old, middle adolescence 14 to 17 years old, and late adolescence 18 to 21 or further than that. So I mentioned that we're going to talk about the developmental tasks of adolescence. So you can take a few seconds to think to yourself, what are these developmental tasks? And the critical task, we're talking about social competence. That's very important. We're going to talk about that extensively. I'm just going to say a few sentences now. So socially, children move from their family into the social arena in a much more pronounced way during adolescence. And so they have to undergo a lot of the phases that they went through with their family, feeling competent, feeling that they're worthy, that they have merit, and going through that with their peers. That's a very important developmental task. Of course, physically, one develops an adult body during adolescence. There's also sexual maturity that is part of adolescence. Cognitively, we're going to talk about that part quite a bit as well in this class. Then adolescents, they acquire more mature thinking and more mature problem solving, planning, and so on. And as I said, identity is the developmental task that Erikson focused on the most, and this has many aspects: the personal identity, the sexual identity, the vocational identity, the person's moral development. We'll cover all that more in this class. So along the years, I've collected all sorts of quotes from parents about their adolescence. So, for example, one quotation is that adolescence is a time when everything seems so important. So, you know, you're sitting there listening to this clip in your home, and probably you've already been through adolescence, and you're much more mature now, and you're able to weigh things and not get too rattled when all sorts of events in your life happen. But think back to the time when you were adolescents and how important everything seemed, and the way that adolescents feel that it's very important for you to empathize with that, so that adolescents, they really feel that anytime, you know, they make a social mistake or something happens, it is critical. So I always cite my daughter, who once, when we told her that she will be on a vacation next week, she said, "Oh no, that's horrible. I'm going to miss a party and my social life will be ruined forever." So that's the sort of things that adolescents often say and think about, the way that these things are so important. If they don't pass the exam, their life is ruined. They will never be accepted to a decent university, and so on and so forth. And another quotation, this one actually from the 60s, "The feelings are so strong. When my parents finally let me do something, then I will no longer have these feelings." So again, you see the intensity of adolescence, the way that the children, the adolescents really feel it in a very intense sort of way, and we need to understand that. I'm sort of, you know, saying this with humor, talking about the fact that, you know, my daughter thought it was so important. But we need to understand that's really the way that they see the world. Here's another one from actually a Beit Barrel student. My 12-year-old son is in early adolescence, and all I ask myself every day is, when will it end? All I hear in the house is, you don't listen to me, you never understand me, and so on. We're going to talk about that. It's called adolescence egocentricity, and the fact that adolescents a lot of the time do not feel that anyone can understand them. We'll talk about that further. So in early adolescence, what we see cognitively is that the adolescents are very concrete in the here and now. This is also very characteristic of school-age children, what's called also in the literature latency, ages 6 to 12 or so, that the children are very concrete and have difficulty with more abstract kind of thinking. They have more difficulty reflecting on others' points of views, and they're really, really concerned with their own needs and have an assumption that everyone should be equally bothered with these needs. Just one second. And as I said, everything is so important during this time, and they have a tendency to magnify their personal situation, really see it as very, very dramatic. When we talk about the psychosocial development in early adolescence, then we talk about the rapid physical changes and a lot of preoccupation that these adolescents have with their appearance and the changes in their body. They seek constant reassurance that they're normal, and it's very hard for them to really feel that way. So if you develop very quickly, then you feel that, you know, you're abnormal, and a lot of the time people will make fun of you and so on. If you don't develop as quickly, then you feel that you're not up to speed, and you're worried and anxious that it won't happen and so on. So it's very hard to feel content during this time. You know, we have these adolescents that all of a sudden at the age of 11 or 12, they can look like women. They can be as tall and as developed as their mothers, and this is very, very confusing, for example. During this time, there is an increased interest in sexual anatomy and physiology, and at the same time, difficulties with impulse control. So we can see all sort of impulsive problem behaviors during this time that have to do with their sexual interest. We also have, of course, pornography online that is a big issue during this time, and children, adolescents during this period and throughout, but this is very pronounced in this period. They're very, very preoccupied with popularity and attractiveness, and measure themselves to see if they're as good as others in their class, in their cohort, in their social group, and so on. So this has to do with the first point in this slide, the importance of the peer group and conformity with peers. That's a very, very big issue. And during this time, we see the move from the family to the friends. So while family is the most important socialization factor when we're talking about the school-age years, the latency years, then here the peer group becomes the most important factor, and the adolescents, they really seek friendships and social cliques that they can be part of. With the gradual development during middle adolescence, then we see cognitively that they are more able to look at other people's needs. I mean, we still have a lot of egocentricity and so on, but still they're able to do that more. During these years, because they are more able to think abstractly, then they're more able to understand abstract causes and ideals, and then they may become very idealistic and committed to social causes. So these days it's a lot about sustainability in Jewish secular society, for example, in the United States as well. We see Greta Thunberg and what she did to adolescents throughout the world. So they have more ability for abstract thinking. It's still not consistent in middle adolescence, and they may revert to concrete levels at this time. But it definitely yes, it does. It definitely does help with their idealism and commitment to social causes. So during middle adolescence, cognitively, adolescents are more able to think abstractly, and one of the things that this causes is that they understand more ideal and abstract notions, and then they are more committed to all sorts of social causes these days. In the Jewish secular community, it's a lot about sustainability. Maybe it's different with, for example, the settlers and the more nationalistic kind of community, where this is more about Zionism and so on. And of course, it's different for the Arab community in Israel, but still we're talking about abstract thinking that leads them to be more committed to social causes. And but still during middle adolescence it's not consistent, and they may sort of revert to concrete thinking. And this of course sense of invulnerability that is part of their egocentrism is also something that we see during middle adolescence. So when we talk about egocentrism, one of the characteristics is this sense of personal fable, that I am unique, that I am someone different than anyone who's been on this planet before, which is true. They are unique, but then again, they're also human and have a lot of common with other humans. So, but still, a lot of adolescents during this time have a sense of invulnerability. During middle adolescence, we see the increase in the intensity of emotions that we spoke about. A lot of the time, this is the peak in the child-parent control battles. During this time, one of the things that we see is that adolescents, they devalue their parents. Mark Twain has a very important quotation on that, which goes something like that when he was 14, he understood that his father was a complete moron, but when he was 21, he was so surprised that he learned so much in 7 years. So that happens to a lot of people. So during this middle adolescence, you have to devalue your parents a lot of the time because you want to express yourself. And part of expressing yourself is knowing what you're not. And a lot of the times what these kids say is, we're not our parents, we're something different. And part of that is also devaluing them and seeing them as less than they are. But then again, as Mark Twain said, by the age of 20 or so, there's a more balanced kind of way of seeing the parents. So they need the parental support. There's also a lot of research in Israel showing that adolescents, they trust their parents and want their support, but at the same time they will reject it a lot of the time because they need to feel independent and they need to be their own individuals. As we said, the peer group is the primary means of social support during this time, and it's part of the separation from the parents. This is an important concept of individuation separation. So you become your own individual, that's individuation, and you separate from your parents, that's separation. So the peer group at that time is everybody, they define everything, and it's a place where you can test your identity, you can see who you are, you can do role experimentation, and so on, and again, all these behaviors that a lot of the time put the children at risk, the adolescents at risk, because of their persistent sense of invulnerability. In late adolescence, we see an improved sense of time and future. We see sort of a more relaxed, balanced picture during this time. I think, middle adolescence is sort of the peak of a lot of the difficulties. So during the late adolescence, the adolescents have more of an ability to assess long-term consequences and benefits of actions. They're more able to think ideas through and express themselves in words, and they have greater ability to delay gratification. They continue to strive toward independence with vocational goals, college when it comes to the United States. Here we have the military service, that is a big thing, at the age of 18. More financial independence during late adolescence. And as I said, at this time we can have a more even sort of relationship with the parents, adult to adult, and the need to devalue them is not as pronounced. During this time, the clique is less important. You see more of a one-to-one kind of relationships during this time. They don't need the peer confirmation as much as they have before. And they have more capacity for intimacy, so they can have more stable relationships and intimate relationships and so on. So this will be it for the first sort of introduction to adolescence, and we'll continue next time with identity.